It's everywhere we look, right? Love songs, romantic comedies, everyone's searching for their soulmate. But have you ever felt like maybe what we see around us isn't really it? Like maybe there's a deeper kind of love that we're all longing for.
Mm.
Well, that's what we're diving into today. We've got this transcript called How Can God's Love Quench the Thirst of the Soul? And it's pretty bold, but the source says that worldly love leaves us empty and that it's God's love that offers true lasting fulfillment.
Yeah.
Because is that really possible?
Well, let's see.
All right, let's find out. One of the first things that jumped out at me was how the source compared our need for love to our need for water.
It is a really powerful analogy.
Hmm.
We all know that feeling of being physically thirsty, right? Like it's this primal urge we have to find relief. And what the source is saying is that there's a similar kind of thirst in our souls. We're longing for something much deeper than anything that we can find in the world.
Yeah, I totally get that feeling of emptiness, even when I'm surrounded by people who care about me. I think we've all had those moments where we achieve a goal or we're in a relationship, but it still feels like something's missing.
Yeah, totally. And the source uses this really interesting example of the Samaritan woman in the Gospel of John. I don't know if you're familiar with that story.
Oh, vaguely.
Okay, well, she had been married 5 times, and she was constantly searching for love and fulfillment, but it seemed like she never found it.
That's interesting because, like, on the surface, it seems like she had it figured out, right?
Yeah.
Multiple relationships, always seeking connection.
Yeah.
But there was still something that wasn't right.
Yeah, exactly. And then she meets Jesus at a well, and he offers her this living water. And obviously, he's not talking about literal water here. He's talking about something that will quench her thirst on like a much deeper level.
Okay, so unpack that a little. What is this living water supposed to represent?
Well, the well itself represents all the things that the world offers us, relationships, achievements, possessions. But the problem is these things are only temporary. They don't last. And so this living water that Jesus is talking about, that represents God's love. And this love, it's described as a wellspring that flows within us, and it offers this like true lasting fulfillment. He's basically saying that she was looking for love in all the wrong places.
Okay, so instead of looking to other people or things to find love and validation, what you're saying is we should be looking inward to a connection with God.
Yeah, that's exactly what the source is suggesting. And here's where things get really interesting. It argues that God's love isn't just an emotion. It's actually decision.
Well, hold on. Isn't love supposed to be all about feelings?
I know, right?
Yeah.
That's how we typically understand love, don't we? We think about it as something that we like fall into or out of based on, chemistry or our circumstances. But the source wants us to look at it a different way. It's saying that God's love is rooted in this deliberate choice that he made. He chooses to love us regardless of anything we do or any of our flaws.
So it's not about whether or not he feels warm and fuzzy towards us on any given day.
Exactly. It's so much deeper than that. It's more profound and more secure because it doesn't depend on us. It doesn't depend on our performance or even our ability to see it. It just is.
I mean, that sounds almost too good to be true, right? To think that you could be loved unconditionally no matter what just because you exist.
Yeah, it is a pretty radical concept.
Yeah.
And it has huge implications for how we understand love. Not just God's love, but love in general. Think about it. If God's love is a decision and not just a feeling, it means that we can also choose to love others that way. It's not about how we feel towards someone at any given moment, but about choosing to love them even when it's difficult.
Yeah, I'm already starting to see how that could change our whole view of relationships. But before we go too far down that road, I want to ask about something else the source mentions. This eternity of God's love.
Yes. That's a really important distinction. The source is emphasizing that worldly love is bound by time and our circumstances, even death. But God's love is eternal. It goes beyond our human experience.
So even if relationships change or end, we can still hold on to this idea of being eternally loved by God. It's actually kind of comforting when you think about it.
It's an incredibly powerful concept. It offers us this sense of security and belonging that nothing else can.
Yeah.
And it suggests that there's a love out there that's bigger than all of our mistakes, our failures, even our lifespan.
Okay, that's really making me rethink what it means to be truly loved. But there's one more point in the source that really struck me. This idea that God's love is totally free. Like no strings attached. We don't have to jump through hoops to earn it.
Oh, yeah, that's so important. We're so used to this idea of transactional love in the world, right? Like we give to receive, we try to be worthy of love. But the source is making it very clear that we don't have to earn God's love. It's a pure gift that's freely given.
That's a complete paradigm shift. If we could just grasp that idea that we're already loved completely unconditionally, I think it would revolutionize everything, our relationships with ourselves and with everyone else.
Yeah, it's a pretty radical notion.
Yeah,
But it's the very heart of what this source is trying to tell us. And what's even more fascinating is that it says this love isn't passive. It can actually change us from the inside out.
so it's not just about receiving love, but about letting it flow through us to others.
Exactly. And that's where the discussion gets really interesting. But maybe we should pause here for a second and let our listeners take all of this in.
Yeah, good idea. We've covered a lot of ground. I think it's time to let these ideas sink in a bit before we go into how this love can transform our lives and relationships. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about this idea that God's love is a gift, not something we earn. I don't know about you, but that's a pretty big shift from how I usually think about love.
Yeah, it really challenges a lot of our assumptions. And, you brought up a great point before the break. If God's love is this powerful, transformative force, how do we actually experience it? Like, how do we tap into that and let it, you know, quench that thirst that we were talking about?
Totally. It's one thing to talk about it theoretically, but how does it actually work in real life? Does it just like magically show up one day?
Well, the source says that just like we nourish our bodies with food and water, we need to nourish our souls by connecting with God. So that means spending time in prayer, reading scripture, engaging in things that deepen our relationship with Him.
Okay, so it's not about just passively waiting for God's love to zap us. It's about actually seeking that connection.
Exactly. Think about it like this. If you have a close friend, you don't just assume they love you without spending time with them or talking to them, right?
Right. Well, it's the same with God.
That makes sense. But to be honest, sometimes prayer can feel like I'm talking to a wall. How do we know God is even listening, let alone loving us back? I think a lot of people struggle with that. Yeah, I think that's a common experience. And the source acknowledges that our feelings can kind of go up and down, but it emphasizes that God's love isn't dependent on us. It's not about whether we can feel it. It's always there. It's like the sun shining even when it's behind the clouds.
I like that analogy. It's a good reminder that even if I don't feel super close to God, it doesn't mean that He's not there or that He doesn't love me.
Right. And the source also reminds us that God is incredibly patient. He doesn't expect us to be perfect or to have it all figured out.
So, what about those times when we totally mess up, when we make choices that we regret? Does God's love really cover everything?
Well, this is where the idea of grace comes in. The source says that grace is basically God's undeserved favor and forgiveness. It's His love extended to us even when we don't deserve it.
So, it's not like He's keeping track of all our mistakes, just waiting for us to slip up?
No, not at all. The source makes it clear that God's love isn't based on our behavior. He loves us despite our flaws, not because we earned it.
That's a pretty liberating thought when you really think about it. To know that you're loved unconditionally even when you make mistakes. But how does that actually change the way we live? This source mentioned that God's love leads to obedience. But I'm always a little hesitant with that word. It sounds kind of restrictive, like following a bunch of rules.
I get that. But the source isn't talking about blind obedience out of fear. It's more like a natural response to this profound love. When we really understand how much God loves us, it changes everything. Our desires, our motivations, even our actions.
So it's not about following rules, but about an internal transformation.
Exactly. It's about aligning our hearts with God's heart, letting His love be our guide.
That makes a lot more sense. It's not about trying to be perfect or earn God's love, but about responding to the love we already have.
Right.
But how does this affect how we treat other people? Like, it's one thing to feel loved by God, but how does that change our interactions with others?
That's a great question, and it's something the source talks about directly. It argues that God's love should overflow from us into our relationships. We're called to love other people unconditionally, just like we've been loved.
Okay, that sounds amazing in theory, but it's definitely a lot harder to actually do. Especially these days. The world feels so divided and judgmental. How are we supposed to love everyone unconditionally when people can be so, well, difficult?
Yeah, it's a challenge, no doubt. But the source reminds us that God's love isn't limited by our human understanding or our prejudices. It goes beyond our differences and calls us to see the inherent worth and dignity in every single person.
So it's about looking past our biases and really seeing people through the lens of God's love.
Yes, it's about recognizing that every person, no matter what they believe or where they come from or how they act, is worthy of love and compassion.
I can see how that would totally revolutionize our relationships. But it also feels a little daunting. How do we even start to cultivate that kind of love? It seems like a really tall order.
It is. But it's not about reaching some superhuman level of love. It's about taking small steps every day to align ourselves with God.
So what would that look like practically? Any suggestions?
The source gives some advice, and one of the most important things it talks about is gratitude. It says that when we regularly acknowledge and appreciate God's love for us, it helps us keep it at the front of our minds.
So we should be intentionally focusing on the love we're receiving, even when things are hard.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a thankful heart, recognizing that even the little things in life are gifts from God. And as we do that, we'll naturally want to share that love with others.
Yeah, that makes sense. You know, they say gratitude is the best attitude. But it's more than just a nice saying. It's about choosing to see the good, even when it's hard.
I agree. It's about changing our perspective, training ourselves to focus on the positive instead of dwelling on the negative.
You know, I'm starting to see how this whole idea that God's love is the source of true fulfillment isn't just some abstract concept. It actually has real implications for how we live and interact with the world around us.
That's what I love about it. It's both profound and practical. It speaks to our deepest longings, but it also gives us real guidance for how to live a more joyful, loving, and fulfilling life.
We've covered so much today. I'm really inspired by all of this. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to acknowledge that this concept of God's love might not resonate with everyone. Some people might even find it confusing.
That's true. We've been talking about some pretty complex theology, and everyone's on their own journey with faith and understanding.
So what would you say to someone who's listening and feeling a little lost or skeptical?
Honestly, I would just encourage them to stay curious, to
Yeah.
keep exploring. This conversation isn't going to answer every question or erase every doubt. But if something here has sparked even a little bit of curiosity in you, I think that's worth pursuing.
I think that's great advice. Don't feel like you have to have it all figured out. Just keep searching, keep asking questions, and keep exploring what feels true for you. And with that, I think it's time for us to wrap up. It's been a really thought-provoking discussion, and I want to thank you for diving deep with me into this topic of God's love and true fulfillment.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Welcome back, and while my brain is still processing everything from that last part.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, isn't it? All those big ideas about love and grace and connecting with something bigger than ourselves.
Right, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface, but before we get too carried away, I want to come back to that first question we asked. Is this concept of God's love really the answer to finding true fulfillment? We can talk about it all day, but does it actually hold up in the real world, with all its messiness?
That's the real question, isn't it? And
Yeah.
the source doesn't really give us a simple formula or anything, but it does suggest that when we tap into God's love, it changes how we see things. We start to see ourselves and the world with more grace and compassion.
Okay, so what does that actually look like? Does that mean like suddenly our lives become perfect and we have no more problems?
Not necessarily. Life is always going to have its ups and downs, right? But what the source is saying is that connecting with God's love can bring a sense of peace and purpose that goes beyond our circumstances. It's about finding this deep and lasting joy that doesn't depend on what's happening around us.
So it's not about getting rid of suffering or reaching some blissful state. It's more about finding strength and resilience to get through tough times.
Yes, exactly. The source uses this analogy of an anchor. When we're anchored in God's love, we have something stable to hold on to when the storms hit, and they will hit.
That's a powerful image. I think it speaks to that human need for security and belonging that we all have, especially in a world that feels so chaotic and unpredictable.
Yeah, a lot of people feel that way. And the source really stresses that this sense of belonging is not something we have to earn. We already have it. It comes from being loved by God.
It's like that feeling of coming home after being away for a long time. But if we already have this home in God's love, why do we still feel so lost and disconnected sometimes?
That is a great question. And the source talks about that too. It says that we often get distracted by all the noise and business of life, our own fears and insecurities and the pressure to achieve things.
So we kind of lose sight of that love even though it's always there, like we forget to drink from the well even though it's right in front of us.
That's exactly it. And the source reminds us that just like we have to make an effort to eat healthy and take care of our bodies, we also have to nurture our connection with God. And that means things like prayer and meditation and just spending time in nature.
It's about making space in our lives for that deeper connection. But how does someone who's never really felt this connection before, where do they even start?
I think the most important thing is to just be open to it. The source says you can start with a simple prayer. Just express your desire to know God's love more deeply. Doesn't have to be fancy or anything. Just speak from the heart.
It's about taking that first step, even if it feels a little awkward. I like that. But what about when doubts start to creep in? When it feels like this whole God's love thing is maybe just a nice idea, but not really real?
It's normal to have doubts. The source acknowledges that faith can be a journey with a lot of twists and turns. But it says we should keep searching, keep asking questions, and be open to experiencing God's love in ways we might not expect.
So it's not about just blindly believing everything, but more about actively searching for truth and meaning. I think that's a message a lot of people can relate to no matter what their beliefs are.
Absolutely. It's about being willing to explore those big questions about life and being open to the possibility that there's more to reality than what we can see.
We've talked about so much in this deep dive, and I feel like I have a totally new perspective on what it means to find true fulfillment. But as we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with one last thing to think about. If God's love is the answer to that deep longing we all have for something more, how can you actually live that out every day? How can you make that connection a reality in your life? Maybe it's through doing something kind for someone else, or practicing gratitude, or just making an effort to see the good in people. Whatever it looks like for you, I encourage you to keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. Thanks for joining us.